Those can be very interesting.
Yeah. Okay, so let's start. Hello, everyone. I am Claudiu Murgan, the host of the Spiritually Inspired podcast, and my guest today is Simona Chitescu-Weik. Simona is a poet, somatic practitioner, teacher, and holistic creativity coach, born in Romania, currently living in Atlanta, Georgia, with her husband and their wild and beautiful 6-year-old daughter. Her work focuses on the intersection of ancient wisdom modalities such as chakra balancing and tantric practice, with a research-based understanding of the nervous system and its impact on the connection between body and psyche. Her passion is for each of her clients and students to come into experiential knowledge of the richness and beauty of their being, others, and the universe. She further invites them to come from a place of belovedness when leaving their mark on the world. Simona is currently editing her full-length poetry collection, leading sacred circles on divine feminine archetypes, building a sustainable coaching practice, and nature bathing as often as she can. Simona, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you, Claudia. It's such a pleasure to be here and to talk to a fellow Romanian.
Exactly. So, because of that common background, I would like to start by asking you, how was your spiritual life look like back in Romania before 1989 and after?
Yeah, because I didn't move to the United States till 1996, almost 1997. So, and I am from a pastor's family, a minister's family. My dad was bivocational for a while. He was an engineer, but his passion and his calling was the spiritual and religious life, and he was a Protestant pastor. Um, Very similar to what here in the States you would maybe think of, like sort of a Southern Baptist tradition. Um, Obviously, without the Southern part, the sort of old world European ethos to it. But yeah, so I grew up in a Protestant home, which is not common for Romania. I think it's still true that most people are Eastern Orthodox or Catholic primarily.
Correct, yes.
Yeah, definitely true as I was growing up. And so I think there's so many layers for me. I think maybe one of the layers that I want to focus on is that, so I was sort of a Christian from the cradle. And, based on the intro that you just that's become larger and more complex for me. It doesn't hold the same meaning and definition. But I think one of the things that was really, really important and sort of shaped my early spirituality was communism and the fact that religious expression was not really allowed, that there were times where my father specifically as a religious and spiritual leader in our community experienced persecution, where our family had mail opened and our phones tapped and were blacklisted. And so there was always this sense that we were in possession of something very, very precious, something that needed to be defended, something that needed to be honored, something that wasn't, like here we talk about the right to religious expression, that wasn't something that I grew up with. It didn't feel like a right. It felt like something that we had to fight for. So, I mean, there was terror and beauty, I think, associated with it for me. And a deep, deep, deep appreciation. I think I was, when I'm a poet and arts, and I worked in academia for a long time as a professor before I transitioned into this. But so as a child, the institutional aspect of religious expression didn't work for me because of just my sort of like natural to the world, I was very energetic as a child. I loved language. And so I couldn't sit through church services really well. I couldn't sit through my father's long sermons. And I would often get rebuked for that. I found connection so much in just like, I think what you would just call everyday mystical experiences. Being out in a, and in Romania, there's so many fields of white wildflowers, like poppies and sunflowers. And I live in Georgia now, and I really miss that because wildflowers don't just grow here, wherever. And I remember as a child just going into a field of wildflowers and like spinning and spinning and spinning till I got dizzy and falling to the ground, connected to God. And it was joy and it was in my body, but that didn't quite have space in the institution, if that makes sense. Like, both in my family and in the church, religion was a very serious thing. And like I said, we fought for it. And then to me, I was having these really joyous, embodied experiences. And I couldn't quite reconcile them. So I would say those are maybe a couple of the aspects of my own kind of early spirituality.
Interesting. And I interviewed a lot of people who had religion in their family. I mean, their parents, like yours, father and mother, were part of the church. They are even ministers, and in fact, the parents try to impose a very strict education, religious education, onto these individuals, and they grew up with scars. They just couldn't adapt. They couldn't understand the message. They couldn't understand why the God will punish them. Why there are so many rules, in fact. And as children, we want, as you said, we want to be free, we want to be wild and understand God and divinity in a different way. So based on what you are saying, you were not raised with such strictness. You didn't have any scars, if I can say so. And am I correct that you were in a way free to choose your path?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't say that. I think I was having those experiences as a child on my own. I had a lot of, because, living here in the United States, like my daughter, who's 6 years old, you just read about her in the introduction, she doesn't go anywhere by herself, right? She's not just going to wander wherever. But I grew up in communist Romania where we could, as kids, jump on a bus, jump on a tram, go see our grandparents, go see our cousins across town. I could go and wander the fields, maybe right outside of the city. And I feel like I had a lot of space to explore and to play. That was just to me culturally inherent. And so my spirituality, my relationship with the divine developed, I think, just because I had space and to wonder, um, like WANDR wonder, but maybe both forms
Yes.
of wonder.
And
But in my family, no. So I definitely grew up with very strict rules. I grew up with a very conservative teaching around original sin, around needing to be saved, around being broken. And it was confusing because, I would hear the Genesis passage that was like, human beings are created in the image of God, male and female, created in the image of God. And that somehow didn't seem to translate with the immediate next teaching, which was, you are fundamentally broken. And no, I think part of the reason I would not say that I am in the, in what that would have meant to me early in my early years, and definitely not a conservative Christian. I struggle with labels to begin with, because I think they can be really reductionistic. But is because to grow up with the fear of hell, and I did, and to grow up with the sense of being fundamentally broken and needing something from outside of me to save me, right? And that was Christ, but really what it was, the way it played out was through good behavior, through going to church, through upholding a very strict moral code, right? And so, no, it's part of why I'm in the Claudiu. I have done a lot of work to to release those things that now I experientially know them not to be true. I experientially know that we are not fundamentally broken. That the truest and the deepest thing about us is, if you will, this imago Dei, this divine essence that manifests in the core of our being, and we are one with all the time. Whether we know it or not, with necessarily our consciousness around it, is just something that is. But yeah, no, I wouldn't say I grew up free of scars. I would say those scars are still there, and sometimes they come up.
I'm sorry to hear that you didn't escape the structure, the dogma, and indeed, this is something which I couldn't come to terms to,
Yeah,
not early on, because I wasn't part of a such structure or family. It was very, very fluid and no restrictions. But later on, when I was able to, think for myself and read and understand the world around me, I just it didn't make sense that the church won't change with the times, and they won't accept the new historical archaeological discoveries based on what happened, let's say, 2,000, 3,000 years ago. And I think the
yeah,
church is still afraid to face the truth, because what they ingrain into the churchgoers is so deep. It will be, this type of revelation will be earth-shaking. It will pretty much break them now in the physical and mental sense,
yeah.
than more than they are right now. So I think they are just trying to keep going with the cover up rather than facing the truth.
Yeah. I think that's true of so many institutions that are in power and that have been in power. Because I think, too, if we look at church history, um, the moment that church and empire joined, right, with Constantine, the entire Roman Empire as Christian, um, the moment that happened, and the moment that, right, this thing that used to be like a subversive grassroots following of speaker and preacher and healer, became all of a sudden the religion of one of the largest empires to have ever existed in our history. um, I think it became about something different. It became about upholding power and upholding control and upholding hierarchy. And I think the reason why the church isn't evolving now, although in a sense, I think there's so much happening, even just in our current moment, where the church is feeling the constriction of the times, of what's going on globally, both with climate, obviously with the pandemic, and with so many other things that are happening in the world, where in a sense the church has to respond to them in some way. And they're realizing, I think, or at least there's in some circles, there's a realization that that which we have held on to as dogma until now has grown empty, stale, constrictive, and can no longer serve us. It can no I mean, the church, I feel like in many ways the church isn't able to have a vibrant guiding voice in times like this, experiencing so much anxiety, so much pain, um, confusion, et cetera, right? And I mean, we're looking at the war, I mean, just even the war in Ukraine, and there's just things going on that, again, are staggering, and we're being called to evolve. But I think to give up dogma, and I saw this in my own evolution. It's like the dogma made me feel safe. In some sense, it was terrible, and it made my soul shrink. um all of it, there's so much beauty too, right, and tradition and liturgy, and so I don't throw it all out by any means. um but there is a safety in the certainty of dogma, and where there is safety, there's a sense of power. And so I think a lot of what we're seeing is power. um yeah.
Yes, and the more I read, I can see the distinction between the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church.
Mm.
Yes, they based their structure on the same teachings and the same principle and the same dogma, pretty much. But I think the Orthodox Church stuck to its pretty much guns, let's say, in terms of what they are teaching from the Bible and from Yeshua. They didn't committed so many atrocities. They didn't try to invade other lands in the name of Jesus and God. It was
Mhm.
just the Catholic Church, and this differentiation I think is very important because it's, even in Romania, there are a lot of priests which kept the old customs, the old traditions, and they do fast and they do offer the support, the spiritual support which is needed. Yes, they still have their own rules
Mhm.
and they cannot, go openly about what they think. But still, I think it's a much pure and unaltered um, way of living than the Catholic Church, which was earth shaken by so many conflicts and scandals and um, reputation and
Yeah.
trustworthiness and all kinds of conflicts.
Yeah, that's so interesting because I think that's true. I think the Orthodox Church in many ways we certainly don't see it in the news as much, and we're not hearing as many things about it. I mean we thought about it from that perspective, so I'm holding what you're saying. I think too with the Catholic Church, I think with Vatican II, and with some of the things that we're also recently seeing from the Pope, and I feel like the Catholic Church is beginning to go through a little bit of those birthing pains of evolution. And absolutely, like atrocities, they have to be named, and we have to be able to speak the truth institutionally how problematic things have gotten. And I think it's true of the Protestant church too. I think at the end of the day, most religious institutions bear a guilt. Um, but I think what I'm appreciating is the is these tremors of there's movement, there's evolution, and I think you see it particularly in maybe what we would call like more contemporary mystic circles, right? Where there's a movement away from this kind of absolutist upholding of rules um, and maybe rituals and traditions at the expense of the human spirit, and a sort of oneself into capital R reality and saying we don't know at the end of the day the first thing about God. Like we have these various revelations throughout time that we can look to, but if we believe that God is dynamic, um, then we have to be able to be okay with we don't know much, and that I think what is available to us is is ultimately going to be experiential. And again, like I said, I don't throw tradition out. I went through a season where I was like, I don't want to have anything to do with any of that. I couldn't bear it. Um, but now I can, there's a season where you can come, okay, what are the threads here that are still luminous and are pulsating with life? And so I think we are seeing some of that. I have a very cautious hope for the church, but yeah, I think I will. I'm curious to look at why has the Eastern Orthodox Church maybe not has not been quite so scandalous.
Yeah,
I think it's an interesting question.
yes, and what bothers me, to be honest with you, is that the church doesn't try to increase our consciousness, our awareness to the world surrounding us, to
Yeah.
make us be more kinder to ourselves first. Because, you mentioned that broken type of concept that we are broken. So they have to to work more on telling us that we are, as you said, we are not broken, and that to pedal more on the we are created on the image of God. And
Yeah.
if these concepts, if they will go deeper into these concepts, I think we will become better. Our consciousness will evolve. And but again, if our consciousness will evolve, we might
Mm.
admit that we don't need an intermediary between us and God. And that will take the church out of the equation, which this is not something they would like to see happening.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, again, like I'm thinking about how the concept of original sin doesn't even exist. For example, in the Hebrew language, sin doesn't even exist in Aramaic. So I'm just thinking about like what even the language that Jesus would have spoken, which would have been Aramaic. Um, and then the of course the translations, because our New Testament is in Greek, right? Is the original language. And so you're taking this um, Eastern, primarily only a spoken language, so not a written, translating it into this Western ancient linguistic system. So one that operates on these binaries, right? Because we know that our entire like Western system of thinking is about duality, and it's how we, right? It's how we understand the world binary. And that's not true of the East. That's not true of Eastern languages. That's not true of Eastern philosophy that has a much more integrated and holistic view. So that's a whole nother, I'm really interested in that. And I did some of that. I studied some of that in my master's degree, because I'm really interested in the way we construct meaning outside of a philosophical system that's predicated on binaries. But all that to say is, I think that the concept of original sin was emergent around the same time that church and empire joined. It makes sense to me because in order to control people, you have to tell them that they're bad and deficient. If people believe that they are inherently good, that they are whole, and that what they need is already within them, right? You don't have to go out to some person, like you were saying, you don't need an intermediary between you and God. God is here, God is inside you, God is in everything that's created, beyond it, but also in it. So if you know that about yourself, you can't be controlled as easily. You you won't succumb to power and oppression. You won't let yourself be used. But I feel like every system, and the church too became this type of system, um, built on hierarchy.
Yeah, and I think that's why, the people are attracted by the Hindu teachings, because a
Mm-hmm.
guru,
Yeah,
which is a real, let's say, for those who are real individuals, really connected to divinity, they will guide you and lead you to think for yourself. They will
yeah,
tell you parables and fables from which you will learn how to behave, how to meditate, how to connect.
yeah,
And one of my favorite fables is when a guru had five disciples, and one of them was a woman, the other four were men. And he said, "Please go and hide so God will never find you." And they all tried different places. One went into the cupboards, the other one went under a rock, and in the cave. And they all came back and said, "God didn't find me." And then the disciple, the woman disciple, came back, said, "Guruji, I couldn't find a place where God won't find me, because God is everywhere. I tried hard, but no, God is everywhere." And he said, "Yes, you got the wisdom." So they are not trying to control their disciples. They're trying to guide them and lead them into wisdom.
yeah, yeah. And I think, thank you for sharing that parable with me, because I'd never heard it, and I love it. I may borrow it and use it with my students and clients. It's so beautiful. Um, yeah, I think even as you're saying this, I feel such a deep resonance, because for so long in my own, like in my early spiritual journey, and I do want to say, because I want to continue to hold complexity and to hold the both and. even in this moment, where we're looking at these large and systems, and they're in many ways broken and faulty and have done terrible things. But like I said, I don't want to throw everything out, because in all of it, there is a thread, there's this luminous thread of truth that I think we're meant to follow. But what I was going to, so even, here's my dad, this religious leader, this pastor, like fighting hard for the faith. And I think in a very earnest and a very honest way. Of course, there's all kinds of, there's shame, and there's the doctrine and the dogma piece. And at the same time, he's also the Thomas Merton in my hand, and Juliana Norwich and Teresa of Avila, and said, go read the mystics. And I think they were my first glimpse of, oh, maybe all this dogma that we're centering our whole world around is not where the true gravity is, right? It's not where life is. And so I think just getting back to, to holding, to being able to the goodness in both. But yes, I feel the deep resonance, because I think about how it is so important for each of us to go on a journey that is all our own. And I think it's a journey that I think we can look to the mystics for. There are ways in which the spiritual journey does have these maybe rites of passage, or these thresholds. There's a period where you go through the dark. And actually not just one time, because I feel like it's a spiral. The spiritual journey is a spiral. So you might keep coming back to a kind of a dark night of the soul. Or, I think about it in feminine terms of like going back into the womb and needing to be rebirthed. You might actually do that multiple times in your spiritual journey, and maybe in your vocational journey, et cetera, et cetera. In many ways, we weren't told that there are, what's the word I want to use here? That there are going to be unique aspects to each of our journey, and that sometimes we won't have maps, and that it's okay to, like, you'll be handed a map, like you were saying with a guru. Like a guru will hand you a map and say, here are some practices and here are some things. But what happens when you begin to engage with those modalities? No one can really tell you, right? Jumping into capital M mystery. And I think what was difficult for me growing up was that there wasn't a lot of space for the mystery. There was this fear of like, wait a minute, you had this experience with God, hold on, let's check it with the text. Let's check it in light of scriptures. The problem is, right, that when we're picking up the scriptures and we're looking at something that has been 10, 12 degrees removed through translation and through various other, right, things, and not just that, but you're looking at the scriptures and you're looking what you're really interpretation or layers of interpretation that usually a man, and in my world, a white man, has made about the scriptures. And there wasn't permission to experiences that were off the approved map, if that makes sense. And so, yeah, I think we're seeing that. We're continuing to see that in large part with the church.
Yeah.
As a
Simona, if I may ask a personal question, have you been able to transcend this type of trauma and find solace in something which you related to? And I'll give you an example. One of my previous guests, Dr. Christina Cleveland from US as well, she went through the same issues at home with her father, and later on in life, she found refuge
Black
in
Madonna.
Black Madonna. Yes.
Yeah, I know her journey.
So it was quite interesting. What was that refuge for you?
Yeah, yeah. And I feel like there have been, so I think initially it was the writings of the mystics. I think initially I was so connected. I felt really connected to St. John of the Cross and his poem that we know of as the Dark Night of the Soul. I mean, this like passionate love poem to God, that's both despair and, right? Have you ever read it or read excerpts of it?
Excerpts from his work, not everything. I'm about to start on that journey. I'm preparing to write my third book in the trilogy about water, and that takes me right now a lot of time because I have to do more reading about
Yeah.
water, and we know so little about it. So that's why I'm taking my time and balancing my reading these days.
Yeah. No, that's so interesting. I look forward to hearing more about that project of yours. But yeah, so for me, I think too, I initially found that refuge in writings like that, writings of poetry, experiences of others that were unafraid to name despair, to name ecstasy, to be deeply human. I mean, you read a lot of these mystics, and I think we put them on these pedestals, but really, what they are embodied humans who are like, God, you're so confusing. What the heck? I don't know what to do with you. I'm in pain. Where are you? So that was an initial piece of refuge. And then I went through a season of such intense darkness, where all of that actually fell away, and I could not bear any Christian language. Everything was kind of bringing back and like just racking up all the trauma. And so during that time, I had an encounter with the divine feminine, um, and the way, and so I've the divine feminine has come to me by different names, but my initial encounter was with Sophia, and this is an experience that I think one day I hope to be able to write about it. I think right now I hold it in many ways and hold the details of it as deeply, deeply sacred. And I'm not ready to really get into all the details of that revelation. I feel like it's even still working its way through me. But I will say that in my encounter with Sophia as this feminine face of God, as this, in a way, like the feminine Christ, the embodiment of wisdom, the embodiment of glory. So with Sophia came this like notion of the Shekinah, which comes out of the Judeo, right, tradition. This energetic, ecstatic presence. Um, so that was, and that actually really led me on a journey of healing my relationship to my body, because I think one of the other things that, at least specifically Protestant Christianity did, and I think it's true for many people, and actually it's true for people here in the West, whether you're religious or not, which is this sort of artificial division between body and spirit, or body and soul, and sometimes a kind of a privileging of, here's the spirit, here's the soul, and that's better somehow, and here's this body, and this body is sort of, it's limited and it's got issues and it breaks down, and I think what we're learning now here in the West, that of course has been true, well, it's been true so much more present in Eastern religion, is that the body is an incredible intelligence, and it's a vessel of union with God. It's the immanence of God, um, inside this flesh and inside our nervous system, our, right, these energetic centers, the chakras. And so part of the wisdom that Sophia brought to me experientially in these encounters was, an invitation to reconnect with my body. And since then, and it's been a few years now, I've just fallen in love with her. And she has been my place of refuge and rest. And through her, I've had other encounters with like, for example, who's been a very, very important figure of the divine feminine archetype, if you will, that, whose energy is alive and present and here. So yeah, those have been profound refuge for me in the feminine and in the return to the body.
Thank you for sharing that with us. And as you mentioned that the body has so much intelligence, that's another reason to take care of it, to have proper food, proper thinking, uh, proper water, which goes into
Yeah.
our bodies. So we have not to treat it lightly, but with deep respect, because as you said, this is the
Yes.
vessel we connect through to God, to divinity. So for those who are listening, please take care of your bodies.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I think that is one of the things that I feel maybe most passionately about is to help others reconnect to their bodies, reconnect to their deep knowing, because when you're disconnected from your body, it is really hard to um, to access the fullness of truth that lives within you. You know, I think that you miss a vital component of intuition and of what I call sovereignty, like the capacity to be sovereign within yourself, and to know that you can access truth within, that you don't necessarily have to go outside and have someone tell you what the truth is, but that you can sit in silence and in stillness and in beauty, if possible. You know, I always recommend nature for that, and begin to listen. And in that listening that happens through this organ of the body, and through the alignment and the union of these other intelligences, the heart intelligence, and the head intelligence. Um, yeah, we can not only we can connect to our deepest self, but we can also connect to the divine, which is amazing because it's there. There's a place where they're indistinguishable, our deepest self, and and then also like realize, and I think that's the other piece, realize how interconnected we are with others, with the earth, with all of creation, how interdependent we are. And you know, Mary Oliver, the poet, she says it so beautifully. It's like a remembrance that we belong to the family of things.
Yes,
So
and we can
yeah,
understand nature when we are still. The more still we are, the more we will see what nature has to offer. So even if we garden or just walk barefoot or watch the sky, it's still a type of connectivity we have with that type of divinity at that particular moment.
yeah, you're right. That's exactly right. And it's so beautiful because I think there's a way in which certain forms of spirituality can make us feel very lofty. And there's something very humbling about even what you were naming earlier, where you said, eat well, drink water, get rest, take a walk. We are bound by certain laws, right, that are written within our body for wellness, for health. And I think that there's something really beautifully humbling about that, that reminds us that we are creatures, and we are capable of absolutely incredible things. You know, I mean, think of Jesus saying to his disciples, "You will do greater things than me." And at the same time, we are bound by needing to sleep. Hopefully, you're getting 8 hours of sleep. Um, multiple times a day, and remembering that this isn't less than, you know, the act of eating, for example, isn't less than, say, prayer or engaging with scripture or whatever your practices may be, that it is actually just as sacred if you can bring the fullness of your presence to it. I just think it's just a beautiful reminder we're human.
Yes. And I'll give you another example of how I lost my balance while
Yeah,
working downtown Toronto, 30 meters underground in a former vault. I couldn't find my balance in um, interacting with the other colleagues. I couldn't find my focus to work on the projects. It was like I was someone else. I couldn't recognize myself, and I had to hand out my resignation like 3 quarters out of on the project, on the contract, because I just couldn't handle it anymore. It was downtown. I was going outside, still building, still asphalt and cars and noise, and but the fact that I was underground, 30 meters underground, that kind of killed my balance, and
yeah,
I had to give up. Never in
wow,
my life something like this happened to me, but I never before worked underground for a long period, forever, in fact, not for a long period of time, forever. So I know for sure that if we are not in nature and we are not in a balanced environment, we can just not be ourselves for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow, what an experience. Yeah.
Yes.
And to feel.
Simona, you are a somatic practitioner. Can you please go a little bit deeper in how you can help people with your expertise?
Hmm. Yeah. Yes. So somatic, right, comes from, which means matter, which means body. Um, and really I mean, I could go deep into it. I'm finishing up a kind of an apprenticeship with um, Kimberly Johnson, who's a somatic practitioner herself, and she's written a couple of books. She's a nervous system expert. So a lot of what I'm learning and studying um, is about our nervous system, all the cascades of hormones, how to regulate your nervous system because it impacts everything else in your body. And because we live in a culture where we are mostly stressed, not getting enough rest, often not nourishing our bodies for many reasons, right? We can get into all the industrialized food issues, and but often not able to nourish our bodies really well, not having all the exposure that we need to nature, even to the earth. I mean, there's negative ions that we need for nervous system regulation. So walking barefoot a day or just sitting barefoot or standing barefoot on the ground is hugely important. And of course, like our ancestors did that, right? There was a lot more connection. And like you said, here we are in cities often on asphalt and concrete, um, in pollution, et cetera, et cetera. Is we need, I think, as a culture, a lot of help in regulating our nervous systems, helping our bodies return to equilibrium, which they're designed to do. Our bodies are brilliant. Everything that happens in the body is for the body to return to homeostasis, to be healthy and to be functioning optimally. So even when we get sick, we're getting sick because the body is actually trying to regulate. And so my somatic practitioning work has this element of working from the standpoint of the nervous system. And I could get into a lot of details here, but just even like noticing and being with my clients and what type of nervous system expression do they tend to favor? Is a sympathetic nervous system, which is highly activated. It's where in the sympathetic nervous system, if you are under threat, you will be in like fight or flight impulse. And then we have parasympathetic ventral, which is our social nervous system. That's where we might have our fawn or our camouflage response when we're under threat. And then we have parasympathetic dorsal expression, where our freeze impulse is. And so every single person deals with stress or when they're under threat differently. They have a specific cascade of hormones and a certain kind of expression that they tend to, right? Some people are more fight or flight, have an expression that's more aggressive, right? And then others, right, freeze. So the part of the work that we do is identify that and I do kind of individualized protocols for healing them. So we look at a lot of different things, but primarily we look at trauma and we work with trauma. So my somatic practitioning practice too is overlaid with internal family systems, which is a psychological, at least that's how it's presented. I think it's way more than that, but it's a modality for for many different things. But one of the things that it does is it helps heal trauma. And so when you overlay the somatic piece with IFS, some really, really incredible things happen. And I could keep talking about it. So I don't know if you had other, like maybe anything else that you're curious about in there, because it's such a
Um,
broad and it's personalized. Like for me, when
yes,
I work with
yeah.
someone, I personalize it to them because everyone's different, everyone's body's different.
And did you find that in the last 2, 3 years, the trauma has deepened and people have to have more
Like,
issues?
like, are people more traumatized? You mean because of the pandemic
Yes, yeah.
specifically? You know, I don't know if I would say that as much as I think what I'm seeing is this crisis. So I definitely think this crisis has created some new trauma. That I think that's true. I think what it's also been though that I'm seeing much more frequently is it's been a trigger for old traumas to emerge
Mhm.
because especially during the time that we had to isolate and stay home, and many people have stayed in their homes for months and months, some over a year. I have a friend who's been primarily homebound for almost 2 years now. She loves it. So for some, it hasn't been a, but I think that particular crucible of all of a sudden not being able to go out, do things, kind of follow your sort of routine and trajectory of life has created almost like a container for things to emerge. And I know of marriages that have ended because of the pandemic, and the husband and wife are at home 24/7 and finally engaging their issues. Um, and I think what I see um, is a lot more of an emergence of old trauma that this particular situation has triggered. Then, and I think, like I said, yeah, trauma too. But I think, you know, one of the things that I've studied, and it makes a lot of sense to me, and I feel like I see it experientially. I've seen it with myself. I see it with my clients. Is that we also bear trauma in our bodies. So we have ancestral trauma, and with everything that we're discovering through the field of epigenetics, we're seeing that we can pass trauma on to our children, right? And trauma has been passed on to us. Anything that's unresolved, because trauma is stuck in the body, in different places in the body. It's neural pathways that get connected in particular ways in the brain and run a loop. Um, yeah, it can be genetically passed down. And so I think that what we're seeing a lot with this is also kind of an ancestral remembrance of other crises that we've been through.
Yes,
And
it's interesting that you mentioned ancestral trauma because a friend of mine recently asked me to write something about GMO and how GMO affects our lives and affects communities. And I mentioned about ancestral trauma, which we don't know how to address anymore. Even in the indigenous communities, some of them have forgotten the wisdom of their ancestors in order
yes,
to heal this trauma. And it's being passed again from generation to generation, and is being accentuated by new events, world events, or things which are coming from the outside their community, and is getting deeper and deeper into their DNA, if I say so. So yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that. Um, and again, I think we are slowly losing this indigenous wisdom. Some people might contradict me and say, no, we are still having it. Yes, but not at the level which we had access to before. And if we don't take, action to preserve it, I
yeah,
think in 2 or 3 generations that will be completely lost.
yeah. I mean, I think I'm holding hope that that will not be the case. But I think between just the effects of colonization worldwide and the enforced assimilation into the dominant culture, into the dominant religion, um, into whiteness, if you will, into like a white overculture. Um, I think that probably a lot has been lost. And I think we're seeing that because I think we are seeing indigenous communities too who are experiencing profound trauma. Um, and yeah, and maybe it's become a bit harder to know how to engage it, because that foundation has been in certain places, and I don't think it's true with every tribe or with, you know, with every community, but it's been either watered down, it's been stamped out, um, it's been made dangerous to continue to observe, right, the old rituals, and to continue to adhere to the wisdom and to pass it down. And so, yeah, I think you're right, and I hope that as we evolve as a race, as the human race, that we begin to, well, not begin, because I think we're seeing some resurgence of respect and attention to indigenous wisdom and indigenous rituals. And again, I think that's complicated too, because we don't want to also just co-opt things because they sound good from an indigenous culture, right? And I think we're seeing some of that in our, and you're in Canada, but here in the United States, um, there's this co-opting that happens, and this kind of assimilation of like, oh yeah, you do this thing, that's cool, oh, I'm going to do that too. But there isn't the respect or the research or the permission or the learning at the feet of an elder. You do know what I mean? So I think
Yeah.
even with that, it gets complicated. Um, we need that wisdom. We need those rituals. Um, I think indigenous spirituality again brings us back. It brings us back to the earth, to our bodies, to our interconnection, and to the divine present everywhere and in everything, which is so deeply healing. It's what we need. Um, but yeah, I think we're in a precarious place,
Yeah.
sadly.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah,
Simona, in the introduction, I mentioned you working on your poetry collection, and that will
yeah.
touch on the divine feminine archetypes. Which archetypes were you drawn to?
Well, I think um, so. One is I sort of stumbled the healing arts in a way. I feel like it's been a kind of a stumbling because you know, I have a PhD in poetry and I was a professor and I thought I was going to be an academic for the rest of my life. And academia, I love it, and it's another institution that is incredibly ways and needs a major overhaul. And I don't know, maybe so I feel like I even need to say that because I so honor so much about academia, and even my own work is really informed by it. Um, and at the same time, yeah, I've I've needed to step away and pursue this, and then I think there's a place where they're all going to intertwine. At least I hope. But I think Mary Magdalene is is the one that is continuous and appearing in my poetry. And I think Mary Magdalene has all but been erased from church history and tradition. You know, she's been painted in ways to kind of her character, and she's primarily named as a prostitute. Right,
Yeah.
it's kind of how the church talks about her. But she to me, and I don't think it's just to me, but it's how my own experience and of her has been, is she is the one that unites all the binaries, including this incredibly toxic binary of the Madonna and the whore. And she is the one that is the embodiment of sacred, of the sacred and the human, of sexuality, and specifically to a feminine sexuality, which I think, again, in the West, it's yeah, I mean, that's a whole, could be a whole nother conversation. You know, what the West has done, one, to women, and like, and in general, and expressions of sexuality and all of that. But Mary Magdalene would be one, and of course Sophia, of course Sophia. Sophia is, I say this, she's the love of my life.
Mhm.
Um, so they show up a lot, but I'm also really interested in Kali. Kali has been someone, the way that she holds destruction and creation, and the maternal instinct as um, as fierce and powerful. The way in which she calls us to a kind of a purity, and I don't mean purity in the old dogmatic sense, but a purity in the sense of a oneness, a sense of oneness and of justice, and of clarity, of purpose. I just love her. I love Kali. So those are a few. I could
Interesting.
name more. But
Yes, I
yeah,
mean,
yeah.
my perception about Mary Magdalene
Yeah.
changed when I read books by Tom Kenyon and Lars Moll from Denmark. And Lars translated most of his work directly from Aramaic. He learned Aramaic since he was 19 years old. And then he went
Wow.
through amazing transformational process, studying with becoming an apprentice to a seer in France, and became
Mm.
a seer himself. And he's an amazing individual. And he, again, these two authors and mystics open up my eyes to who really Mary Magdalene is. And then I talk about the idea openly on my podcast, because the moment you feel that something is right, especially for me, I don't hold
Yes.
back. I don't care what other people think. I really don't hold back, and I don't care what they think. So I promoted that idea, and I think the church, if I'm not mistaken, the Vatican, openly but quietly admitted that Mary Magdalene was not a prostitute but a priestess and an equal of Yeshua. But again,
Yes.
very quietly, no publicity, in order for the masses to find out that the teachings now are different, and they're not the same. So
Yeah. Yeah, and it's like the church has been really quiet about the Nag Hammadi Gospels too.
exactly.
And right, and they were lost for so long and buried, and I'm like, oh, no wonder, because um, they hold a revelation, I think, has been probably systematically withheld from us, by patriarchy, honestly.
Yes. I think they are not pleased with the fact that they couldn't get their hands on those scrolls before anyone else.
Yeah.
So they can hide them in Vatican's library.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, now we have access to them, which is wonderful. But think about how many people don't read them because they're
Yeah,
they're scared to read them. They're told not to read them. They're not inspired
yeah.
with scripture. Yeah.
We are approaching the end of the interview. Any final thoughts?
I think just my thought is just I'm really really grateful for this time and for this conversation, and even just really your your own journey with Mary Magdalene, and sounds like with the divine feminine. I think I'm finding that to be, again, another kernel of hope for me as I'm, watching the fact that we are on the cusp of either evolve or die, as I think that's what humanity is essentially encountering right now. And I think that this emergence of the divine, not as a not as a reaction to the masculine, because there is healthy masculinity, there is divine masculinity, but as a principle that's been suppressed for so long, that we have so deeply needed, because it holds its own qualities and its own energy. And I don't just need it because my primary expression is as a woman, and I need to be able to recognize myself in God. But I think both people who are male or female or non-binary, it doesn't matter at the end, even like your gender expression and sexuality and all of that. I think the masculine and the feminine principle lives inside of us, and we have needed to reacquaint ourselves with the feminine. We have needed to remember, And then I think we need to also remember what the healthy masculine looks like, right? Because we've seen a lot of toxic
Yes.
masculinity.
And as other, as previous, some of my previous guests said, we have to find a balance between the masculine and feminine, because they both resides within us, either we like it or not. So
that's right. Yeah, and Jung said that too, with the anima and the animus. We have those energies within us. Yeah, and for the third thing to emerge, you need the two forces, and you need the union. So
Simona,
the
thank
mystery
you
is
very
the
much. Thank you very much for your time today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Claudiu. It's been such a joy to be with you.
Thank you. And for my subscribers and viewers, thank you for watching. Share it, like it. Get a free copy of my book when you visit my website. And until next time, love and gratitude.